Hello, good evening. My name is Christine Ockrent. Welcome to this Versus debate brought to you by Intelligence Squared, Google Plus and YouTube. Our proposition tonight for consideration is Europe, wake up. We will only return to growth and prosperity if we finally complete the single market. Before we engage into this discussion about this rather complex issue, let's listen to the Commissioner in charge here in Brussels, Michel Barnier.
Thank you, Christine, and good evening to all of you online and here in Brussels. Thank you for joining this debate. Europe is often criticized for not involving citizens enough, and I agree. We are trying to fix that. This debate is a good start. Everyone can share ideas, can argue and participate. Tonight we are discussing the importance of the single market. Who is it for? Why does it help you? Will it be the solution to bring us out of the crisis? The single market was born in 1992, 20 years ago. Its effects have already been significant. Thanks to the single market, you can travel, study, live and work in any other EU country. Businesses can sell their products and offer their services all over Europe, in a market that is 5, 10 or 50 times bigger than their national markets. Consumers have access to 16 times more products of better quality at a lower cost. These freedoms are unique to the nations of Europe. No other group of countries has ever achieved this. Trade between EU countries has multiplied by 3.5 times. The single market has created 2.7 million new jobs between 1992 and 2008. But our 20th birthday should not be a backslapping celebration. Europe has been in crisis since 2008. This year we expect zero growth. In some of our nations, 1 in 2 young people is unemployed, and this situation is not acceptable, and we do not accept it. We are taking steps to deal with the crisis, but most of all, we need to create real economic growth, a new growth, which does not only mean more growth, but also greener, more inclusive and more innovative growth. We can find this much-needed growth by pressing ahead and completing the single market. We should make it work better, work for what is needed now in 2012. These are difficult times. Building a strong Europe means completing a strong, dynamic and forward-looking single market. But now it's time for you to decide whether you agree with me or not. Let the debate begin.
Merci, Monsieur le Commissaire. Let the debate begin indeed. In order to put it in perspective, for the past 3 days, we've been running a pre-vote online, and it shows that 55% of you are in favor of the proposition. I guess you can't all be British, but still. 24 are against it. 21 do not know. So let us start with those 2 experts who are indeed in favor of our proposition. And let me start with you, Lord Hannay, David Hannay. You are a member of the House of Lords in London, a member of the Select Committee of the House on European issues. You were a former UK ambassador to the EU, and you were part of the team which actually negotiated your country's entry into the Union. Do you regret it now?
No, not in the slightest. And I don't regret either being one of the British negotiators for the Single European Act, which triggered the single market.
Do you consider the single market still to be the best tool to induce growth again?
It's not the only tool, but it is an essential tool, I think. You hear a lot of talk at the moment about the need for more Europe. mainly in the context of greater integration to deal with the financial side of the crisis that's going on now. I think there should be a lot more talk of more single market, because any growth strategy worthy of the name is going to have an element of more single market.
In spite of the Eurozone troubles?
Because of the Eurozone troubles. Because if you look at the remedies that are being put forward by the Commission, by the Central Bank and by the IMF for countries like Spain and Italy and Portugal and Ireland and Greece, you will see there's a large element in them of sweeping away the obstacles that still exist to the single market, because these are obstacles that are inefficiencies. They're creating lack of competitivity, which is at the heart of the problem of these countries.
And so that would be an argument for Britain, whatever its own position vis-à-vis the enlargement or deepening of the single market to banking services, for instance. It would be a good reason to actually support more single market. I think
the British government, which I don't entirely agree with, strongly supports the idea of completing the single market, not just to financial areas where the Commissioner is quite rightly proposing new regulation to deal with the problems that arose in 2008, but also in areas like services, which is very imperfectly part of the single market now, energy, and the whole issue of a digital single market, which is absolutely crucial for the future prosperity of all our countries.
Professor Saka, you teach management at Évora University in Portugal, and you specialize in innovation. Would you agree with David Hannay that indeed the single market helps innovation within the Union?
Absolutely. And entrepreneurship and innovation is a key to that. And I would agree, like what David just said, that we have to, again, think about this digital single market. That's something that few of us are talking about. And the crisis actually is an opportunity to go towards that direction and make sure that businesses have even more opportunity. Much of the regulation that is in place right now is before the digital internet era. So it's an opportunity for us now, for the entrepreneurs to see some regulation changes and be able to be much more competitive than they are right now.
And so that would be an impetus to create even more jobs in that particular area?
Absolutely. A study from last year by McKinsey showed that about 20% of the growth that comes to the economies actually comes from the network economy, from internet economy. So it's fundamental to simplify the rules and to start creating a real digital economy.
Okay, let me now turn to those of you who don't agree with our proposition that indeed the single market should be implemented further and indeed enlarged. And let me start with you, Professor Curzon-Price. You taught economics in Geneva. Why are you so convinced that it's no good for us Europeans? You live too long in Geneva, I gather.
No, and don't worry. A lot of what has been said, of course, one can't disagree with. But my problem is with the method. The method of creating Europe is based on harmonization. Harmonization because if you don't have reasonably level, equal starting points, then free trade is not fair trade. And this is the level playing field theory. Now, I would submit that this is a false theory. It's actually wrong. If I may just use a sporting analogy with a horse race. A horse race, the fastest horse has to carry a handicap because otherwise the outcome would be a foregone conclusion and the whole thing would be boring for the spectators. But racing is not the only game in town. And it could well be that the purpose of racing the horse is to get an urgent message from A to B. And if that's the purpose, then it's no point in weighing down the fleet horse. You have to get it there as fast as possible. You must take away the obstacles in its path. And this is what I claim is needed for Europe. Harmonization places obstacles in the path of the most efficient firms. Because harmonization means actually everybody has to be brought up to some particular standard, if possible a very exacting high standard. And this puts smaller firms and less developed members to a disadvantage. In point of fact, harmonization has prevented the Portuguese, the Greek, the Spanish, the Polish, the Bulgarian firms from being able to use their natural comparative advantage. They would be doing fine.
Well, we'll be listening to some witnesses. I'm thinking about a friend in Poland whom I think will disagree with you really with a great deal of conviction. But Professor Krauer, you're Dutch. You at the Free University in Amsterdam, and you specialize in political parties and polling.
Yes.
To what degree? I mean, Holland has always been for free trade. It's a merchant nation. It's been doing extremely well thanks to the Single Market Act for the past 30 years. So why would you not agree with this proposition that indeed we should go forward with it?
Because the Netherlands has been doing quite well for the last 4 centuries. And we were a merchant nation already in the 16th century and doing quite well. Thank you very much. We were actually a world power. The idea also that the Netherlands is now prospering because there is this Europeanization, this one single market, is not true. I think the success of Europe was also because there is a welfare state. And I'm afraid, and you also hear that the Commissioner already very clearly saying that all these products now we have 16% more good products, and those are freedoms. Those are not freedoms, those are products. I'm sorry. Europe was also the part of the world that had a welfare state that protected people from market forces, protected them against the evils of capitalism. And I think that just focusing on only single market, on only competition, taking away all the barriers, you're taking away the protection of people. And it is why people will support all kinds of policies, because they are protected against certain ills, against unemployment. And having half of the youth unemployed in Europe means that they will no longer favor Europe. And so European policies are undermining Europe rather than helping them.
Okay, but let's agree on one thing. So far, social welfare policies are national policies. So if I understand you right...
Undermined by Europeanization.
Okay, but then would you be... That's a very French position, by the way. If I understand you right, you'd be in favour...
The French are right sometimes, yes.
Of a sort of social welfare system harmonised on the union level?
Well, I think whether you do that locally, nationally, or at the European level doesn't matter, but I think what characterized Europe always and what made it so successful is that it took care also of the people who lived there in terms of social rights, in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of in case of unemployment. And
that the single market has, in your view, hampered, hindered,
well, just look at the people who are against Europe. Just look at the people who are against Europe. The people who are against Europe are the ones who are more vulnerable in their job, who are lower educated, who have less chances at a really totally competitive market.
And that's new, in your view, or has it always been the case?
It's not new, but what it means is that those people will not support Europe, which means that people who only support Europe is an elite, a well-educated elite who benefit from Europe, and there will be a large section of the European population that will actually not benefit from Europe, but become its enemy. Do we want to live in a continent...
That's not very true of all those young people who are lucky enough to be educated and who the Erasmus generation.
Sure. Oh, I'm not saying that the rich and the elite are not prospering and they can travel around.
Not only the rich. I mean, we have an education system which is fairly
okay, and how many of the people that are unemployed now in Spain, 50%, are going to do this Erasmus exchange? I'm sorry. Those people have to work... Those people have to actually work for 500-600 euro per month if they find a job. Most of them won't find a job, have to live at home. They have a real tough time. They're not so supportive of Europe.
And that, in your view, is because of the single market?
Well, no, but the single market is not the solution to their problems.
Right. Okay. Now, we've heard all your expert views. And don't worry, you'll have more time to put forward your arguments. But we'll now get to the heart of the discussion, in which we have witnesses, people who are, in a way, in the real world. And of course, we're not. We're in a studio. They're all over Europe, thanks to Google Plus Hangout technology. And they will discuss with you and argue and tell you whether you've been right or wrong in their view. So let me start in Warsaw. I'd like to invite Konstanty Gebert to make the case I think, Konstanty, you're in support of the proposal to indeed expand the single market. You're a journalist in Poland, you're a former member of Solidarity in the 80s and a special advisor to President Mazowiecki in his days. So tell us what, in your view, the single market has brought to Poland and to Europe.
Well, the single market has brought most everything. If you travel around Poland, you will see a country which physically completely is dissimilar from the Poland I remember from 20 years ago. This is the impact of the EU's cohesion funds, which do not hamper the best horse, but give horses that have been brought up on a starvation diet in their stables a fair chance. From the Polish perspective, joining the EU and joining the common market meant that we can count on the solidarity of neighbors to make it possible for our citizens to fully develop their potential in Poland or abroad. This was brought home to a personal incident. My elder son, a couple of years ago, fell in love with a Spanish girl, which was always a good idea. And then there was talk of his moving to Barcelona, which definitely is always a good idea. And I realized that he's talking about transferring to Barcelona the way I would be discussing transferring to another city in Poland. The boundaries existed only on maps, not in his head. Well, each time I fly out of Poland, I can physically tell when we are crossing where the Iron Curtain is. This is the change brought about by the single market. It has been a huge boon to my country. Okay, does this mean it is a universal panacea for everything? No. The single market is not a solution. It is an environment which enables solutions to flourish. This is why I support the motion.
David Hannay, do you wish to encourage Konstanty to...
Yes, indeed, because his views are very similar to mine. But I'd like to ask him whether he would confirm that in his view, the single market has been one of the elements which has enabled Poland to make the very successful transition from a command economy and a total lack of democracy to a working democracy and an economy which has been growing even through the recent crisis. Does he think that the single market has contributed to that in a positive way?
Absolutely. Poland was extremely fearful about the impact of the single market. We were afraid we will not be able to compete. After all, we were joining a club in which other members have had much more experience, much more time, and much more money invested in doing well. Today, Poland is competitive on the European markets. The fact that it has still resisted the crisis is empirical proof of that. In fact, I would argue that what worked on the economic level would also work on the political level, a political common market in which ideas can compete not only inside the different nation states, but across the Union would, I think, vastly improve the political debate.
And do you think that the same is true of other Central and Eastern European countries who joined the European Union at the same time as Poland? Do you think they too have seen a positive help from the single market?
They have been given the same chance Poland has been given. They use it because countries are different, and it is not one size fits all. But the real comparison is between those Central European countries that joined the common market and those like Ukraine that didn't. If you want to seek alternative to the common market, travel to Kiev, travel to Minsk. That's what the alternative is.
Professor Krauer, would you contradict this marvelous love affair between Konstanty's son and his Spanish girlfriend?
Absolutely not. I encourage them. But it is one of those stories of people who are internationally oriented, who basically have the skills to talk to people abroad. So apparently both speak English or something. This is clearly a story of the elite. And my point is not that Europe is not good for the top section of society who can travel around, who can go to universities. I am talking about those people at mid-level or even lower education trying to find jobs. And ask this contributor how many problems also Poland has, and how deep the social divisions are in Poland, with people at the lower tiers of society who have really hard time in functioning in these competing markets. And Poland is not a rich country still, and has problems of basically covering the basic services to these people, and that is often neglected. And my point is not I'm against a market. I'm saying if you want to do what is now being proposed in finalizing the market, you also have to have some sort of social help for people who can't make it in the open market.
Okay, so what's your question to Konstanty?
Well, would he also agree that the social disparity, so the inequality, has risen in Poland and in other countries in the European Union?
Konstanty.
I certainly agree. The social cost that Poland has paid joining the market has been very high. Point is, had we not joined, we would have paid just as high price, if not higher. Again, look at Ukraine. Ukraine has a single market. Social disparities there are incomparably higher than in Poland. But social mobility is much less, because what remains is a constricted control system in which people cannot protest. I'm extremely pleased to call the member of the elite, that I'm sure my son would be, but we were not in a part of an elite, and we had not become part of an elite until the democratic transformation. We were among those millions of Poles whose opportunities the system blocked. Now, we are paying a high price. I would think that a pan-European social common market, in which a social welfare system, affordable but functioning, could apply across the continent, could be one possible solution to the problem.
Does that convince you?
Well, I think what you see here is that there is some sort of agreement that if you want a European Union to function, and you want a safe European Union, and you want also a European Union that actually creates people who can work there, you need to also think about social welfare arrangements. You cannot just talk about the European market.
No, but Konstanty agrees with you on that score.
The problem is, of course, that he then should oppose the proposition, because the proposition said that we have to fully finish the single market and return to prosperity. And I think to return to prosperity, we need to also finalize the social Europe, because you can't disconnect them. And I am fearing that what is happening now is that the crisis is being used, or I would say abused, by the political elite to disconnect more the social Europe from the single market. There's an argument now that the single market has priority over everything because we need to go back to economic growth. And I think it will increase disparity, socio-economic disparities in Europe.
Konstanty, in a few words, are you more optimistic?
If, in fact, completing the common market would mean excluding the social responsibility of states and of the Union, I'd be against it. But my understanding of completing common market is extending Europe-wide solutions, be they economic, be they social, be they political. Yes, harmonizing our systems. Of course, if the cost, the social cost, would be neglected, it would be counterproductive. The common market is there to create opportunities, not to increase disparity.
Thank you, Konstanty. Yes, David.
If the single market, as you and I agree, has been of great benefit to Poland, it's of course greatly increasing the fiscal capacity of Poland itself to help its own people. Wouldn't that be true?
However, I do think that harmonizing, say, the service market across the continent would be another step in the same direction, would be something that would help Polish service providers provide services in other countries. And
okay, Konstanty, thank you very much. We now go to Ireland so that you, Professor Saka, have a word with someone who is very much in your field of interest. Ronan O'Brien is an online retail entrepreneur. You're based in Ireland. You sell all sorts of stuff, of course, novelty stuff worldwide. And tell us, what is your experience being a small businessman, or rather a businessman running, for the time being, a small business. How is it like today operating within the EU for you?
Okay, well, essentially, I own 11 businesses that I started in the last 5 years. So we're kind of a constant startup. That's where we start new businesses. The big issue with the EU is that we never really finished the single market. We started into it, and then we created this whole thing of having 27 different VAT regimes and this EU legislation that didn't keep up with the times, the Distance Selling Act, which is completely antiquated. And essentially, it can be easier to sell to customers outside of the EU than it is to sell to our own neighbours because of this half-finished single market. And it is a good idea to have the EU in place. I think we need to push forward, and we also need to keep up with the chase of change. So there is definitely a new economy. Online retail, technology, digital movements, these are all quite important, but we need to catch up to them because this is where the jobs are actually happening. So we've hired 100 people this month alone, and these jobs are really, really important. I think at the end of the day, the EU has a problem with banking crisis that is worldwide, but more importantly, it's got a job crisis. Once we fix the job crisis, we'll bring in taxes, it'll get people working again, and we can move forward. But until we allow people to work, we allow companies to create the jobs, then we're not going to be able to really get back on our feet and move forward.
Shumadip, do you agree with him?
Hi, yeah, hi, Ronan. See, there is no prototype for the European common market. This is the first time that countries have advanced towards this. So it's a learning by doing experience. Much of the problems that you are citing, that it's much easier to, for example, to sell in the US than it would be to Greece, are things that are being worked on. I can give you an example. On the 8th of October, just 2 days back, the European Commission has come up with a document about how to simplify the VAT structure to make it much easier for companies like you to sell across digitally to other countries in Europe. So there are problems, of course, but as you probably would agree with me, that these problems are being resolved. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it's going to happen. I hope you agree on that.
I'd like to agree. I think it's quite important to do it. Eventually we will get there. I think we need to push it forward because the rate of change that happens in the new economy, maybe we're a bit slow to catch up on legislation-wise.
Professor Curzon-Price, to get back to your horsemanship comparison, he's a very young horse. Obviously full of energy, and he doesn't need whipping or anything. I mean, he can do it by himself. So don't you think that indeed harmonization of all these regulations would help small companies like his?
I think what he needs is the obstacles to be taken away. And as long as the creation of the common market and the single market was a matter of taking away the obstacles to the racehorses, then that's fine. That's fine. But the trouble is that Europe does both. You take away the obstacles, but in order to create the level playing field, you harmonize. And this harmonization looks fine to begin with, but what it does is you harmonize to a high level of safety, consumer satisfaction, you gold plate the regulation, and then suddenly, instead of having 27 different regulations, you have one very strict regulation, and then that is no progress.
And so what would be your question to Ronan?
Well, I would say, what exactly would what would you ask of Monsieur Barnier? What would you like him to do to make it easier to do business?
I think the first thing is to empower the customers. So the customers should be given the responsibility of the option to make choices. At the moment, there's legislation like the distance selling legislation. It stops companies ever getting off the ground. And I think you've got to empower somebody. So a small example, and this is a very micro example, we sell party wear as part of a costume business. And we used to sell decorations saying Happy New Year's Eve 2011, 2012, that kind of thing. And we actually have to stop doing it because the EU says they can return this after the event under this legislation. And the product at that stage is absolutely no good. It's been used, and we're entitled to give them a full refund. In fact, they don't even have to return it. All they need to do is say, we don't want it anymore. And that's daft. But because that happens, we stop selling the product. People want to buy it, we want to sell it, and there's a little bit of legislation in the middle that stops business from happening. If we can pull that down, empower the customers, I mean, we have new ways of protecting ourselves, such as reviews online.
André, you approve of that argument?
I was laughing because indeed it's also the idea that you can micromanage from Brussels everything that goes on in these countries is also, of course, but I think that has failed already. And what I think it feeds deeper into the fact that I think a big problem in Europe is that basically policy making has shifted from national states, national parliaments to Brussels. And that's a huge problem because now policy making is done in Brussels and then accountability is back at national parliaments. But the disconnection between the two means that Ronan cannot go to his national parliament or to his MP in this case and say, look, listen, do something about this, because that MP is totally powerless to do this, to arrange this. So
is that a good argument in your view?
Well, of course, that lack of democratic accountability is a very important point. But I think the case that Mr. O'Brien is exactly my point. What you have is an antiquated piece of legislation which is common to all. It happens to be disastrous. Whereas if there'd still been variety, then at least the disaster would have been concentrated in one or two of these countries, and it wouldn't have been universal. And
yes,
competing
but he happens to be Irish.
Competing jurisdictions between countries allows many different regulations to subsist, and markets will discover the best regulation. And this would have permitted such firms as Mr. O'Brien's to find and to go into those markets where the regulation was best.
The result of that was that the single market, before the single market existed, no foreigner could sell a bottle of beer in Germany.
But it had to all be produced in Germany.
Now there is proper competition, and I suspect the beer is still pretty good in Germany, and it's probably quite a lot cheaper too.
But you have the principle of mutual recognition, which you, sir, know very well.
Yes, well, that was Arthur Cofield who pioneered the single market, and he was a strong believer in that, and it has come into force in many ways.
Ronan.
It hasn't been used.
Back to you, Ronan.
Yeah, I think the problem is that we went to a habit. We said we'd open up the single market, and then some people said, oh no, we want to overprotect the consumers and not give them an option to choose what they want. So what you do is you shift the responsibility from the people that want to buy to the people that will take advantage of the law, and have the good customers subsidise the people that are going to use it to steal and to send back products when they shouldn't be within their scope. And I think we need to pull away some of the legislation and just say, let the buyers and sellers meet and say, okay, well, if we tried that, it hasn't worked, let's move on. It's not saying that the EU is bad or anything that we've done isn't good, we should pull back. We just need to go the whole way. This half-house stuff doesn't work.
And as you work out of Ireland, would you say the same thing about fiscal policy?
I don't think we can get one VAT regime across 27 different... I mean, it's not possible. I think what we need to do is give the information out there. I spend a lot of time on administration burdens, and as I start each company, I come across the same ones over and over again. It's very difficult to get all the information on all the different VAT regimes, all the thresholds, and you really could have a situation where you pay your different VAT rates to the Irish government, who then passes on a large bulk and deals with the governments on that basis. So if you can take away the tax collecting duties on the small companies, large companies can handle the tax collecting duties. But when you make the burden so difficult, I've seen many companies where they just say, you know what, I'm not exporting outside of my country because I don't want to spend my whole day pushing papers around a desk and trying to keep people happy, and then being responsible and in trouble if you get the wrong things, because not everybody's an accountant.
Well, yes.
What Ronan is really saying is that he's looking forward to a real single market, because what you see Europe as a huge opportunity, and you see all these obstacles in your way, and there are many Ronans in Europe. There are Ronans in Berlin, there are Ronans in Barcelona, they're in Dublin. And instead of going to your national assembly to ask for the simplifications, you have to come to Brussels. It's true, but it's happening, and that's what I'm saying. That entrepreneurs like him, they look at Europe as this terrific opportunity. What they're looking for is some help in terms of reducing all the barriers, some of the barriers that exist.
But Ronan is saying that nobody of his people is in Brussels because the big companies are in Brussels and they can negotiate. But Ronan says, I'm not. Small companies are don't have a representation here, and nobody's telling the European Commission and the European Parliament that that is what you should fight for, because small companies are actually the job creators, but they're not represented here. And they're not listened to here. That's what Ronan is saying. And I think you should listen to what he's saying.
But Ronan has been heard because, like I gave the example, one of the problems that entrepreneurs like him have has to do with the VAT system. And it's antiquated and different countries have different rules. So that's being worked at.
Ronan, do you have the feeling that you're actually being listened to here in Brussels?
My feeling has been that when we do put something forward, and unfortunately I've been over to Brussels before to discuss this, you've got very big lobby groups with a lot of money, and they're going to spend their time pushing forward their agenda, which is big companies are allowed to go ahead, small companies are going to be held back. And I don't personally want to spend my time doing administration. I don't want to spend my time telling people how to run Europe or any governments. I need to get on with what I do, which is technology. And there is no one who's really representing the case of the small businesses. But yes, all we want to do is create jobs, is make sales. And I think you need a few logical movements there. They are going that direction. I think they're trying to get there. I just think we need to get there sooner.
Ronan, you're a very, very good, you have very good arguments, and I hope Commissaire Barnier will eventually come to you for advice. Let us now turn to Paris, of all places, with Niccolo Milanese. Niccolo, you run the European Alternatives Institute, which is a think tank based in Italy. You work within the EU to promote how could I put it, a fully transnational democracy to try and empower European citizens better. In your view, tell us what exactly it means to have a single market. Is the completion of the single market good for Europe, for democracy, for more democracy in Europe today?
Thanks. Good evening, Christine. European Alternatives is a transnational organization, so we're not based in one country, such as Italy. We're based right the way throughout Europe and have offices in many of them. For me, the crucial three factors for the future of Europe are prosperity, yes, but also the extension of citizens' rights and the extension of democracy. Over the past 60 years of European integration, the method that has been privileged has been a market-led integration. And my fear with our discussion about the single market is that we're being led down the same path again, thinking only about the economy and the market and thinking that will solve all of our problems, and ignoring some of the political issues which are running alongside and behind those economic problems. I think now in Europe we're seeing the limits of market-led integration, and those limits are democratic limits where citizens are starting to suspect that their rights are being undermined by Europe and their democracy is being undermined as well. Now, they might be mistaken in some ways about that. There are many things that Europe has done to extend rights, some things that Europe has done to extend democracy as well. But the fact is that more and more citizens blame things like the single market for undermining social rights, for undermining long fought for rights at the workplace, their pensions and other things, as well as undermining their national democracies. And that's quite the opposite of the kind of Europe that I want to see and I want to live in. The kind of Europe I want to live in would be one where our rights are extended, where we're given new rights by Europe, such as the right for free movement, or where Europe is working as a way of pulling us all up to the best set of social rights in Europe, rather than down to the lowest common denominator, which is the impression that many Europeans have. Likewise, for democracy, I want to see a Europe where instead of democracy effectively being suspended, or people feeling like it is suspended in countries like Greece or in Italy, where democracy, if I dare say so, is being run at the gunpoint of the market, we have an extended democracy where citizens are able to have a say fully over the full range of European issues at a European scale. Now, in that context, if we renew the approach to Europe, the single market could be a force for extending rights and extending democracy. As the largest market in the world, it would allow European citizens to have political agency over the way global capitalism is working. We could influence that as European citizens.
We're supposed to have a European Parliament. You don't think that that actually gets the job done?
Well, I think the European Parliament works very hard, and it's a great thing that it is there, but I don't think it's sufficient. I don't think it has competencies over all the areas that it should have, notably European economic governance. And I think that the crucial figures making the decisions in the Commission and at the head of the European Council are largely unelected and therefore unaccountable. You simply can't vote out the President of the European Commission if you would like to. And starting from that point, we don't have an authentic European democracy.
David, what would be your arguments to encourage Nicolo to be more optimistic?
I'm not sure you're aware that since the Lisbon Treaty entered into force 2 years ago, the European Parliament is the co-legislator on all single market measures. So any measure that the Commission puts forward has to be agreed both by the Council and the European Parliament. That's a huge increase in the influence and power of the Parliament, and they're making quite good use of it. If you look at the changes they make to single market legislation, you can see that they're having a very big impact. And you say about spreading democracy, well, I agree with you in many ways, but the European Union has produced the biggest spread of democracy ever known in the continent of Europe. When the Iron Curtain came down and the Central and Eastern European countries joined the European Union, that was a massive extension of democracy. Now, it takes time, obviously, to develop a European democratic system, and it's a long, long way from being a purely democratic system. But I do think one should recognise that with the powers the Parliament has in the single market and the extension of democracy into Central Eastern Europe, there's been some very large positive shifts.
Nicolo?
I agree with you, David, that there's been many positive things done by Europe. I don't think that the vast majority of citizens think that the European Parliament has the say over all the economic issues which are affecting their lives right at the moment. I think many of them feel like they are under the rule of another foreign European country or under the rule of market forces. I don't think European citizens have the impression that European politics is controlling the market or creating a European common good. I think citizens have the impression that certain forces are able to dominate European politics and certain forces are able to dominate the European markets, and that those forces do not have the interests of all European citizens at heart.
André, you're on the same wavelength than Nicolo. How could you encourage him and his think tank to actually promote your common ideas?
Well, I think I agree with Nicolo when he writes that the European Council, the European Central Bank and the European Commission have become dysfunctional. And I think there's a reason why they've become dysfunctional, is because they're not checked. It's because people cannot say that they made a wrong decision. And so what I think needs to be done is we need to reconnect national politics with the pooled level of decision making. And that means very simply, you do away with the Commission and all the other institutions that are now there forming the executive, and you make all the prime ministers or a series of ministers from national governments the executive of Europe, so that they actually have to negotiate. And you make
that's what they do at the Council of Ministers.
But really accountable. You throw away the European Parliament. It is nobody is going to vote for it anyway. 40% now, 43% turn out at elections, and you make national parliaments or a part of national parliaments the European Parliament. Basically, you then reconnect again those people who make policies, and you make also people both in Europe and in the national parliament accountable again for the decisions that they make in terms of policy, and at both levels they can be sent away. And that's how you reconnect, and that's how you get democracy, and that's how you get a functional democracy.
Nicolo, would you agree with that?
No, Mr. Cruel, we may be on the same wavelength, but we have very different kinds of solutions. I believe that we need to have a decisive move to transnational democracy. I think that actually the national parliaments have too much control over European policy, and they're holding Europe to ransom. Rather, what we should do is to empower the Commission by giving it authority. Authority in Europe comes from democratic legitimacy. We should elect it, and we should empower the European Parliament further. I think that's the only way to ensure that the European common good, the common good of the European citizens, is best protected.
Nicola, have you talked to citizens recently who don't show up at the polls? Now, a majority of European citizens don't even bother to vote anymore for the European Union. How on earth are you going to make...
It's because they don't think there's anything to vote for, Andre. It's because they don't think there's anything to vote for. And we need to show them that there are essential issues that they have to vote for, and that they have the power to change them. And that they can change the whole of Europe, not just their own country, but the whole of Europe, and ultimately the whole of the world. I don't put all the blame, by the way, on the politicians. It's easy to sit here and blame politicians. I also put a lot of responsibility on citizens themselves. I think citizens throughout Europe have to recognize their common interest and mobilize themselves transnationally. That's what my organization is trying to do, to create the Europe that we want to live in. It's easy to sit back and criticize. We have a responsibility to do it. With that regard, if I might add, I have a lot of sympathy with Ronan's position as a small business person. Small businesses have difficulty doing business across Europe. Non-profit associations have even more difficulty because we have less resources to deal with some of the difficulties thrown up by the incompleted social market. If we were serious about democracy in Europe, we would make it easier for associations and political parties, for that matter, to act genuinely across Europe. It's for years that we've been calling for a statute for European associations. It hasn't happened yet. It would be the minimum to do to show that we're serious about promoting citizen involvement and citizen democracy in Europe.
Nicola, one last question to you. Would you be in favor of a sort of direct election of a president of Europe by European citizens?
Well, I think that if the European political parties nominate their candidate for the president of the Commission at the next European elections, that would be a big move forward. The president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, was re-elected a couple of years ago with almost nobody noticing. No other candidates, almost no media coverage. There's something very strange where the president of the European Council is re-elected with nobody noticing. So I think something needs to be done about that, yes.
Okay, thank you, Nicolo. Let's now go to Seattle, of all places, to listen to a Greek economist, Yanis Varoufakis. Professor, do you believe, we listen to you quite often commentating on the euro crisis, do you believe that the single market, the improvement of the single market, the completion of the single market is indeed a silver bullet for growth in Europe?
Let me begin by stating my position that a borderless Europe is a major civilizing force, not only within Europe, but also without Europe. So we all are on the same page there. The problem I have is that while the euro crisis is erecting barriers daily across Europe, throughout the breadth and width of Europe, we are now having this conversation as if the discussion about the extension of the single market is separate from the euro crisis. I do not believe it is. But let me explain this by firstly stating what I think there is a major dichotomy between the single market myth, that effectively we are creating a level playing field which is welfare enhancing throughout Europe, with a single market reality. The way that we conceptualized and implemented the single market is no more than an exercise in enhancing oligopoly power, especially for the financial sector, for the banks, which is worsening the internal imbalances within Europe. And that has been a major contributor to the euro crisis that we're facing. So the euro crisis is not separate from the way that we have constructed the single market. If you want, the Eurozone was a natural extension of the single market idea. And that extension effectively exposed the very deep problems with the way we are handling the single market. And the point I want to make here is this. There are many different barriers between our different countries within the European Union, and I am all for removing them. However, what we have been doing under the myth of a single market and a level playing field, we have been proceeding very fast, at a very fast pace, removing all the barriers that protect the weak and the small businesses. And we have been extremely careful not to touch the barriers that protect the powerful oligopolies, in particular of the financial sector. Now, let me give you a very simple example. The whole idea about a banking union now in Europe. You can see that we confirm this more in the breach than the observance by having the June summit of the European Union agreeing under Mr. Monti's and Mr. Rajoy's and Mr. Hollande's pressure to having a banking union. And what have we been doing ever since? The powers that be in Europe have been dismantling the idea of a banking union simply because the bankers do not want to lose their cozy relationship with national regulators and national governments.
You're going a bit fast there, because the banking union is a process which hasn't stopped.
The banking union is dead in the water. It has been killed by a letter that Mr. Schäuble wrote in the Financial Times. And you will see in the next few months that it will be confirmed in the breach, not in the observance. And let me just complete my little tale here by saying that why can't we conceptualize what we're doing as a process of creating a single society? Why a single market? You see, there can be no such thing as a single market. Britain doesn't have a single market. It has many markets. It has goods markets, manufacturing, it's got financial markets, labor markets.
So do other countries. I mean, it's not a British specialty.
Therefore, you see, I think semantics matter. The concept of a single market is completely fraudulent. Unless we have shared commons, shared public goods, shared protections, and unless we have some way of sharing norms for distributing wealth that is being produced collectively and privately, we are simply not going to move towards a single society. We are going to have this fallacy of a single market, which is a misnomer, which effectively does nothing more than to create the process of unification of markets, which has led inexorably and inevitably to the Eurozone crisis at the moment.
André, you have another ally there.
I couldn't agree more. And moreover, what has been taken away from central governments by creating this one Eurozone into this one single market, on top of that single market, now the Eurozone has an additional problem in that macroeconomic policies has been taken away from national governments. They cannot evaluate, they cannot do anything anymore to protect their economies against these external shocks.
You were in love with competitive devaluations? Was that a good system?
I'm just saying that now...
Was that a fair system?
Maybe not a fair system, but...
By social standards, I mean.
But at least there was a mechanism by which a national government could say to their people, vote for me again because I'll do this and this and this, so that macroeconomically I can try and reverse the negative trend. Now, that's been taken away from governments, so governments now go into elections by promising all kinds of economic policies that they cannot guarantee because they need to negotiate that with other countries. Why do you think in Europe the two major party families, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, are being exterminated slowly but generally? It is because those two parties, those two people's parties, had broad social coalitions. They had working people and entrepreneurs into one party under one sort of ideology.
Maybe because it didn't really work as far as citizens are concerned.
It's because the European single market is destroying that social deal that they had. That middle class people pay a little bit more money because they get actually a good social deal. They get actually good education and some safety in the streets.
Yanis, do you agree with that, given the state, unfortunately, of the Greek political system?
Look, I'm a committed European. I don't hang on to sovereignty as if it's the ultimate ideal. But what I want to see is a Europe that works. And a Europe which is conceptualizing itself as a single market and not as a single society is bound to fail at producing even a unified market. So it's a self-defeating objective. As I said, unless we have shared public goods, unless we are prepared with the loss of sovereignty to forge the social norms which are necessary in order to support a single market or a common market, then our attempts to create a single market are self-defeating.
I think the problem about this discussion is that you seem to think that the people who are arguing for more single market believe it is the sole solution to all Europe's problems. I don't believe that for 1 minute. I don't think it's an either-or question, it's a both-and question. And the single market is part of both and, as is the greater integration of the Eurozone with the banking union, which I take a less pessimistic view than you about the chances of it being agreed. I think there will be a big row next week about it, and there will probably be agreement before Christmas about it. But we'll see who is right on that. But the argument being advanced, certainly from my side of this, is not that the single market is the solution to everything. And by the way, the single market cannot possibly be blamed for the 2008 crisis, which was caused by the subprime mortgage market in the United States. Nothing to do with the single market in Europe.
If I may, first of all, to put this all in perspective, what it seems to me so far that we all agree that we are converging, and there's greater need for convergence, and we need to do some things to make this convergence faster at different levels, at political level, social level, and economic level. I'm not going to apologize for banks, but the power you speak about the banking system exists everywhere, including the United States. And the United States is often looked as a model for the European Union as a single market. We also, and I completely sympathize with your position, but we also do not see transfers between states in the United States. Alabama probably has a per capita state income per capita about half of Maryland, but we do not see the transfer from Maryland to Alabama. So there are lots of disparities, including in the American economy and among the different states.
Yanis, would you buy that argument?
No, not in the slightest. The United States of America is an excellent example of an economy, of a currency union, which is replete with a number of functioning surplus recycling mechanisms, the military-industrial complex being the most significant one, but I don't want to waste much time on this. What I want to say about Europe in particular and its banks is that we have this amazing regime whereby bankrupted banks are insisting on being capitalized by bankrupted states. And you have this death dance, this death embrace between the insolvent banks and the insolvent states. And banking union is the only thing that's going to stop this death spiral, which will in turn contribute to the disintegration of Europe and render our discussion completely academic. And the banking union that has been mentioned, as I said, I'm all for it. And this is a great test for the single market. Because if we fail to create a banking union at a time when the banking union is the only thing separating Europe from disintegration, this will be ultimate proof that all the barriers that affected the weak have been removed, but the barriers that are affecting the bankers who do not want central supervision and who will find technicalities in order to usurp and annul an effective banking union, therefore preserving the term for something that denotes something completely different to the essence of the banking union. That confirmation is going to be the death knell of both the single market and the European Union.
Professor Curzon-Price.
Thank you. Well, I would agree with Yanis that the lobbies of the powerful are very powerful in Brussels, and that there are about one lobbyist for every European civil servant. So the lobbies are about 50,000 lobbyists. And it's normal that it should be the big companies that have the lobbies. And the European Union is not your transfer union that you're asking for, but it's a regulatory union. And so I return to my point that the regulations coming out of Europe are in favor of the established firms, of the big firms. And this makes it extremely difficult for small firms and peripheral countries to survive. And to the extent that we have free trade and then we have regulated trade comes in afterwards. And these regulations have been pernicious for the smaller and peripheral nations of Europe, including Greece for that matter. And
Yanis, you have the last word on this.
My simple point, which I will just repeat for the sake of argument, is that the single market discussion that we're having today cannot be seen as separate from the euro crisis. The banking union is a litmus test to see if we're really serious about unifying and removing impediments. I see no evidence, unfortunately, that we are capable of doing that, simply because throughout the history of the single market formation, we have not managed as Europeans to ensure that the impediments and the barriers that are being removed are not only the ones that favor the oligopolies and the financial sector, but are the barriers that are essential for the maintenance of social life.
Thank you, Yanis. We now turn to our final witness, Sebastian Dullion. You are a professor of international economics in Berlin, and you're another specialist, an expert on European economies. Sebastian, how central do you think Europe's position in the world is due to the completion of the single market?
Well, I think we have to separate two things here. First, the single market as it is today, and then the next steps which are supposed to be taken to finalize this market. And when we look at the single market today, I think this is very central for how the rest of the world watches us and looks upon us. Actually, we are a role model for the rest of the world. Whenever I travel around the world and look at other regions which think about regional integration agreements, they always look at Europe as a model. And the single market is part of it. The ease with which business can actually sell abroad and sell cross-border, this is something which the businesses in Argentina and Brazil would be dreaming about. And even if you have some different VAT regimes, and there are some obstacles left, I mean, we can just bring goods, parts, components, custom-free across borders. If I travel to Paris, I can go in the morning, I'll be back in the afternoon. I have no border controls, no passport controls. This really eases things. And if you talk to German businesses, this is at the heart of their success in production. The production networks, they span across Europe, and they are only able to do that because of the single market as we know it. That being said, the question is whether really, doing the next steps is equally essential. In a way, I have the impression that while the house burns, we are discussing whether, having some other interior paint might increase the rental value of the house. Because, I mean, it's all nice to have to even remove the last barriers, but it's neither going to bring us any significant growth, and actually it's not even able to compensate what's going wrong in the euro crisis. At the moment, we are moving towards a completely fragmented banking and financial market. German banks don't lend to Spanish banks anymore, not to Spanish companies, not to Spanish households. That means a very well-managed Spanish firm now has to pay a higher interest rate than a badly managed German one. And this leads to a situation where all of the business starts concentrating on their home market, and actually German businesses are cutting back their production networks, their production sharing, because they don't know whether their counterparts in Italy or Spain will get the loans for the next step in the production. And this is something, the single market is more than just the rules. It has been made by companies, which actually brought that to life. And this is disintegrating at the moment and quickly. And I would agree with Yanis here. If the European Union cannot come to grips with that, I mean, it's just cute what we see under the Single Market Act 2 from the Commission. And, watching them trying to push that forward in this situation, in a way, could be funny if the situation weren't that serious.
David, is it funny or serious or both?
No, I think I agree with much of what you say, because I would not suggest for 1 minute that completing the single market is the only thing that makes sense or is needed now. I just think it's one essential thing, along with sorting out the problems of the Eurozone and indeed of Britain, which is outside the Eurozone, and other member states whose economies are not that brilliant at the moment. And all that has to be done as well as completing the single market. But to my point of view, and I'd be interested what you said about the view outside Europe, I think completing the single market to include energy, to include the digital area, to include services properly, because services are a huge part of all our economies, and they aren't a single market at the moment. All that will contribute to any growth strategy worthy of the name, but they will not be on their own the solution. And above all, I would ask you whether you agreed. I think it is very important to continue to avoid a Fortress Europe approach, because if Europe is to be more successful economically in the future, I think I'd be interested in your views. I think we need to realize that the most rapidly growing markets are outside Europe, not inside Europe. So we need to be competitive to be able to win those markets or to win a share of those markets. And having a single market helps us do that.
Sebastian?
I would say we will be measured by outcomes. And, well, in a way, what we have done now that this promotes growth and innovation was a no-brainer. It becomes much more difficult for the areas where we are now going to liberalize. Take energy or take the railways. I mean, we all would like to have more competition, lower prices, but we still want to have reliable supply. And in those network industries, my profession, the economists, they don't really have good solutions how to do it. There's no clear-cut solution. It's much different than from, let's say, the market for apples or, steel or whatever. And that being said, I'm not so sure how big the benefits really will be from this next step. And if they are only small, then it doesn't change that much in our global standing. I would agree completely with you that a Fortress Europe approach is not the right way to go. We need to be attractive for our partners in Latin America or China, and the European market needs to remain attractive as a market they want to come to and want to sell in. And this will only happen if we manage to prevent the euro crisis from leading to a breakup or a segmentation of this market.
Professor Saka, the euro crisis is really at the knob.
Absolutely. In terms of the timing, this we have to speak about the euro crisis when we speak about the single market. But once again, your arguments, with which I agree with most of it, is again arguments for greater simplification, for greater unification, for in the case of energy, liberalizing energy sector even more. In case of networks, once again, making all these infrastructure networks function. Rail operators should work from one country to another country without any problems. Same thing with the banks. Now, having said all of this, once again, and again getting back to what David said, this is just one of the dimensions. The other dimension that really worries me, that we're not really talking anymore about the Lisbon strategy. Whatever happened to the Lisbon agenda? Why aren't we speaking about what's happening to our R&D investment despite the crisis?
Well, unfortunately, the Lisbon agenda has long been forgotten. It hasn't
Absolutely,
really...
and we should somehow or the other bring it back on the agenda. What went wrong? Why did they go wrong? We should analyze this, because if you take away a cluster of countries like Germany, Sweden, Finland, and Denmark, the rest of the countries in terms of R&D investment, it's way down, much lower than what, for example, China is investing now.
So, Sebastian, why do you think the Lisbon agenda sort of sank in the...
I mean, the first thing is that productivity is nice to have, but no one really knows how to create it. The second thing is there has been a change in the view of these things among economists. In the past was that productivity is only a supply side thing. There has been more recent research which is saying, well, at least if you have imperfect financial markets, as we have in most countries, and especially in Europe, recession cuts down on research and development because firms cannot borrow and invest that in research and development. So there is this important work by Philippe Aghion, and he's saying, well, if you have more macroeconomic fluctuations or larger fluctuations, then you will have less investment in R&D by the private sector, and in the end, less productivity growth. And the numbers he puts forward, they're really impressive. They are much higher for what we could gain from a more stable pan-European macroeconomic environment than from tweaking in some of the network markets.
Professor, so yeah, just a reaction to what to your argument.
Very quick question, Professor. My question would be, why are we not creating any Googles in Europe? Why are there no Microsoft? Why are there no Apples falling in Europe? And maybe that's one of the dimensions that I would like to push this argument towards. I don't know if you have any suggestion or if you have a comment on that.
I mean, I would ask you why do we have the biggest and most successful car companies in Europe? Why do we have Siemens or some of the network suppliers? In a way, you can ask whether maybe some of the German culture or the German or even the European system of educating people is more geared at the manufacturing sector than at the service sector. And well, Apple might not be all that positive. I mean, as a monopolist, they have a revenue to profit to revenue ratio of almost 50%. So half of the money you pay for your iPod just goes directly to the shareholders. That's nice for them, but the question is that really what makes an economy big and good? And we should not forget that the US is not able to sell in a lot of markets. Their car companies were not competitive. The manufacturing sector had a lot of problems. And just because they have some big internet companies does not mean that the economy as a whole is so much more competitive and innovative than the European.
But it's certainly more reactive in job creation, as we've just seen from the last figures. André?
Yeah, it's very beautiful because basically here's the argument that there's the Romney argument of the trickle-down economy, that if you give shareholders a lot of money, it will trickle down into the economy. And I think you're correct in saying that, Sebastian, that is not the case. What you need to do is to, in Europe, empower, I think, those entrepreneurs that are creative, that are trying to make new products. Smaller companies also have a very, very high productivity because people are actually very close to the product that they're making and they know what they're making and they're trying to make it better than anything else in the world because it's their thing. And so I think that only focusing on the market aspect is neglecting on where innovation comes from. And innovation comes from well-educated people. And we have been cutting down on education in many countries and educating people less than we did before. And that is a huge problem. Okay, more people enter education, but education, I work in an educational institute, it's really downgrading in terms of its quality.
Let me thank Sebastian at this stage, because I think we have really heard our four witnesses and many of our experts' arguments. I wonder now what you, Professor Sarkar, have actually what do you get from these discussions, and particularly from our witnesses? What would be the sort of dominant argument that you would remember?
The sense I get is a bit of frustration. Why not?
Your frustration or theirs?
Their frustration. Why not is there more? Why are there still these regulations that's stopping Iran from doing business, much more business in Europe? So once again, all these are arguments for us to work and think about loosening up, not harmonizing like Victoria was saying, but loosening up some of the regulations. And from my viewpoint, which I'm speaking about small and medium enterprises, making it much easier for them to use this great opportunity that Europe offers as a market.
Your impression?
Yes, I would say that the point that Europe needs to be deregulated hasn't come through in the discussion, and that, for my mind, that's the most important thing. If you want to restore competitiveness to, let's say, Portugal, what Portuguese firms must have is access to the European market. They have it. There are no barriers. There are no tariffs. There are no quotas. It's easy to just the transport barrier, but that's okay. But yes, of course, the single market is fine when it sweeps away the barriers. But the trouble is that in doing so, in order to create the level playing field, there is the re-regulation problem. And then the Portuguese company has to make the product according to a standard which is set by a complex process in Brussels. Instead of coming along with a product of its own device, if the consumers don't like it, then they don't like it. Just let the consumers set the standard rather than the complex bureaucratic process that we have in Brussels, which re-regulates the system so that the smaller, unempowered business firm just doesn't get, it has a heavy handicap to fight with. And that's where the innovation comes from. Innovation doesn't come out of the big firms. It comes from the small ones, and then, of course, it gets taken over by the big ones. So,
yeah, I think what I think this debate brought, and I think Ronan pointed towards it, but certainly Yanis, is that also the single market causes a lot of problems. And the fact to close your eyes for the fact that it causes a lot of problems. I can, for example, give you a very good example in Spain, where I often reside, where the European single market...
Where you have a house in the sun.
Where I have a house in the sun, because my partner also lives in Spain. But that's beside the point. The point being is that the European market forced also banks to go national, or at least offer the opportunity. What happened is that corrupt local banks run by politicians, the cajas, became certainly a national banking system. And they have infected the entire banking system in Spain. So here you have a beautiful example where European legislation and the single market, and the so nicely free market, has basically created corrupt local politicians to span a national network that's now collapsing the national banks. Now the European Union...
There was no corruption before.
There is, but they were local and they could be contained. And now they became national. And now the now the European Union is forcing those cajas to integrate into good banks that actually behaved and are infecting them. So I say, please look at the negatives of the single market. It also causes problems, it causes inequality, it causes corruption. Please don't close your eyes for that, because if you do, you're actually declining the level of support for the European Union. We need the European Union to continue because there's no alternative. We can go back to warring nations if we do it. But if you keep continuing and closing your eyes for the negative impact of the single market, you are losing the European citizens. And we can't have a Europe, and we can't have a single market without the European citizens.
David.
Well, I thought the startling thing that came out of that was that all the witnesses and all the experts believe that the single market is very necessary for Europe, but they have criticisms, some of them, of the way it's been developed, too much regulation, not enough removal of barriers. I think that's an entirely legitimate criticism, but you have to realise that if you were sweeping away 27 sets of national regulations, you couldn't just have no regulation at the European level. We're seeing in the banking field, for example, the argument is that the banking regulation that was put in place in 1988 was too weak, and it now has to be strengthened. So I don't think you can present this as a choice between, on the one hand, removal of all barriers, and on the other hand, no regulation. I think you have to have a balance between them. But I don't think myself that there was any of our witnesses who really disputed that the single market was a crucial part of the European project, but not the whole of it. And I'm not arguing it's the whole of it either. I'm just saying that without it, we'd be a lot worse off and that we need to complete it.
Let us check at this point whether we have any reactions or any questions from the web. The question first is from Mark Salmon to Yanis. Bigger, more centralized government is always attractive to politicians and less good for the individual who gets further removed from power. Don't you believe your views of what Europe should do will make that problem worse? A question to you, Yanis.
Yes, thank you. Well, this is always one of the great conundrums about democracies. On the one hand, we need to have participation at the local level. On the other hand, we need to have a central government. This is true for Britain, it's true for Germany, it's true for Greece. Now it is becoming true for the European Union, for our common European home. We need to find the political institutions that allow participation at the local level to be combined with the civilizing force of a central government that can provide the space, the political and social space, in which shared commons and shared public goods can develop.
Now, another question for you, Victoria, from Olivier de Broqueville. How can a European worker fairly compete with a Chinese worker who works 16 hours per day at least and has no social security? That's a question for you. It's not a horse, it's a Chinese worker.
Yes, well, that is the eternal question. And the quick answer is that the productivity levels are not the same, that one of the reasons why European wages are so high is that the productivity on the whole is quite high. We've had over 200 years of accumulating capital, and we've invented a lot of machinery, and it's there, and therefore when somebody does some work, he's enormously helped by the accumulated capital of 200 years. In China, they're getting there. It'll take much shorter time, and at the moment it's painful because the Chinese worker is working much harder than we Europeans. But still, look at it the other way. The reason it is an achievement for Europeans to be able to earn high incomes and work so little, and we're not by no means engulfed yet by Chinese competition. I think it's fair to say that Europe doesn't export quite as much to China as it imports from it, but it hasn't such a terrible trade balance, and that's one of the ways of looking at it.
Another question, obviously, all that you've said have stirred a lot of interest on the web. That's a question for Nicolo from Seitango. You say Europe is at the gunpoint of the market, but a democracy addicted to debt will always eventually be run at the gunpoint of the market. Is it their fault? Nicolo.
Look, I think that ultimately, it's a political choice that's being made at a European level about how freely the market should be allowed to run. And if I say that some European governments are being held at the barrel of the gun of the market, I think that's a political choice being made by other politicians at a European level to force certain kinds of agendas through. I think we can't separate the economy from politics. We can't keep the pretense that the market is self-sufficient. The market is something ambivalent. The question we should be asking ourselves is, what kind of single market do we want? For what kind of Europe do we want? There, I think I'm coming rather close to Yanis's point that it would be more productive to talk about creating a single European society and talking about what kind of society we want, rather than talking as if the market is insulated from the rest of what is going on.
A question now for Ronan in Ireland from Sasa Marinic. Who should be protected, she asks, the seller from a scamming consumer, or the consumer from a scamming seller? That's a good one.
Both.
I don't think it's an and/or situation, to be honest. The consumers can be protected. So, for example, usually when they buy online, they'll buy using a credit card. So they can do a chargeback if they get scammed. And essentially the money goes straight back into the user's account and out of the retailer's account if they get scammed. And likewise, the retailers have to give a little bit of protection, or certain products can't come to market at all. Certain jobs can't be created. And then we have what we have at the moment, which is a huge level across Europe of unemployment. So we need the balance right. But what I'm saying is it's not up to the Europeans to dictate on a parliament level what the situation is going to be in terms of protection. I think we need to let that balance out itself, as it does in America. There's no same protection in America. Online retail is still huge. There's still massive protection. And people don't go back. There's no sustainable business in a scam. So people do research the companies they buy from, and they tend to go with companies that are real. But they're not going to find the small scam companies because Google de-indexed them off the listings in the search engine, the same with all the other search engines. And at the end of the day, the way they pay will protect the customers because they have all the chargeback facilities, be it credit cards or PayPal or its equivalents.
Okay, another question for Nicolo, and that will be our last question from Kate Ash. Do you want some democratically empowered citizens, she asked, but where are we going to find them?
Well, I think we can start with ourselves. All of us are citizens, and I'm pretty tired of people saying that citizens are not interested in politics or they're not interested in Europe. If you've gone into any cafe or bar over the past 2 to 3 years, you'll know that citizens around the whole continent, let alone actually in the rest of the world, are discussing what ought to be done about the debt crisis in Greece, what the consequences will be, and so on. There's an enormous interest. What we need to do is to provide ways of citizens taking part and feeling like they have the power to take part and have an influence. I think some of those means are being opened up. European citizens' initiatives are now available under the Lisbon Treaty, have just come into force, and my own organisation is running one to promote media freedom and pluralism. I think that we have to provide good examples of citizens working together transnationally to change Europe.
Thank you, Nicolo. That's a very enthralling programme. I subscribe to it. A final word from each of you now.
Well, Professor? I think Nicolo's got an uphill job ahead of him. Because
we all have.
At the present time, what we have in view is a fiscal union, a banking union, tax harmonization, a financial transaction tax. All these things are part of completing the internal union and coping with the current crisis. And you know that there is in political science this notion of mission creep, that all bureaucracies, all institutions like to enlarge their remit. Well, this isn't mission creep, this is mission leap. The EU is actually going now to really disempower the European citizen, but in a massive way.
Professor Supa.
I do not agree. But getting back to the overall perspective that I had and the message that's been given is there is convergence. There is need for a greater convergence in certain areas. There's need for the entrepreneur to feel that it's as easier, if not easier, to sell within Europe than sell outside, which is some of the cases. But what we have to remember is there is no blueprint. I'm not going to apologize for the political process, but there is no blueprint. This is the first time. This experience is being taken at such a stage, at the degree at which it's been taken. So it's going to happen. But once again, my concern is not just of this dimension of convergence of the economy. I'm also concerned about other issues. I'm concerned about entrepreneurship. I'm concerned about what's the role of universities play in promoting entrepreneurship. Can EU policy support in some way, give incentives, or even the Horizon 2020 program for universities to create startups. So these are other concerns I have, which I'd like to share, at least at
for the next debate. Yeah. Professor Krauer.
Yes, I'm very concerned. I wish I could share the optimism of Nicolo. I feel that the low level of legitimacy of the institution of the European Union is declining. I think their handling of the southern governments and forcing policies to their throat is also declining rapidly, the support for the EU in those countries where it was usually very high. And I think it will go to a point where it will become actually crucial if the European Union can actually survive, because the support is so low, the behavior of the elites is so disgusting to most citizens in Europe, who of course support institutions that actually have an output for them, that gives them job security, that gives them a sort of well-being, a good life. Those institutions in Europe are now seen as undermining that. And I feel that if that cannot be reversed, if that cannot be changed, then Europe will not survive.
Lord Hannay?
Well, I don't think completion of the single market, which is after all what we're debating this evening, can be described as either mission creep or mission leap. It's back to basics. It's back to the basics we all decided in 1986 and partially implemented by 1992, and now we need to keep on with that job. It's not going to solve all our problems, but it's certainly not at the root of the problems, quite the contrary.
Thank you very much to you all for your excellent contributions. Thank you also to our 5 witnesses. I think it's been a very vibrant discussion, and I'm sure we will have many reactions again on the web, and we will of course publish the final vote on the Versus page that you are now familiar with. Thank you very much from all of us here in Brussels.
Thank you.
Thank you.